Traffic jams can be infuriating at the best of times, but if you knew that your morning commute was being held up by climate change protesters, would it endear you to their cause or cause your temperature to rise? Hello and welcome to Roundtable. I'm Enda Brady. Now, climate change is arguably the single most pressing issue of our time. After decades of not being taken seriously, some activists have decided that only radical action can wake people up to its dangers. But just how effective is gluing oneself to a road or defacing priceless art?
Just Stop Oil making a splash. This eye-catching protest by the group in 2022 got the attention of people on all sides of the climate debate. And more recently, they sprayed orange powder paint on Stonehenge, one of the UK's oldest and most cherished monuments. They're known for their disruptions at airports, art galleries, and even sporting events such as Wimbledon. Just Stop Oil is an environmental group that is campaigning to reduce global warming. They're demanding for all oil, gas and coal licences issued since 2021 to be revoked.
We don't want to be disrupting ordinary people, but we've tried non-disruptive protests for about 30 years since we've known about the climate crisis, and it hasn't been listened to. The government has not listened to that. The only thing that gets the press, journalists and presenters, they don't want to report on the climate crisis unless we cause public disruption.
But not everyone is keen on their tactics.
The issue with these militant protesters is one that I know many of your listeners and indeed myself are incredibly frustrated. These eco-zealots are selfish, they are disruptive, they're causing misery.
Research led by the University of Bristol found that 82% of respondents considered climate change to be either very or fairly important. 68% disapprove of the Just Stop Oil group.
What are they achieving? Seriously, what are they achieving? Well, I've got a family to feed, and what are they doing?
Just Stop Oil aren't the only climate activists using disruption as a new tactic. Last year, Shell sued Greenpeace for $2.1 million in damages over fossil fuel protests in the North Sea. So has climate activism gone too far? Or is this just the beginning?
Well, let's meet our guests. Joining us from London is Peter Kirkham. He's a former Detective Chief Inspector for the Metropolitan Police in London. Here with me in the studio is Just Stop Oil spokesperson Bing Jones. Ruth Townend is a research fellow in climate diplomacy and risk, and that's at Chatham House, which is a think tank. And Sam Nadel is interim director at the Social Change Lab, a non-profit conducting and disseminating social movement. You're all very welcome to Roundtable. Bing, I'll come to you. When I think of Just Stop Oil, I'm reminded of an old football chant about Millwall. Nobody likes us, we don't care. Is that your kind of mantra?
I'm sure that there are a lot of people that don't like parts of what we do, but we do care. We do it because we care. And we do it because the world is just fabulously, terrifyingly hot. And it's so hot that it's going to cause massive problems for everybody in the future. It's going to get steadily hotter. It's hot because of carbon emissions from burning fossil fuels, and we need to stop burning fossil fuels. Instead, fossil fuels are still increasing. There's no sign of them falling, and Just Stop Oil has a demand, and the demand seems to me absolutely sensible. The demand is that our new government starts to negotiate an international treaty, a binding international treaty to stop all oil, coal and gas extraction and burning by 2030. It's a big ask, and what the programme, this discussion here is about, do protests work? And the answer is that I just don't know whether protests work. But one thing I do know, and that is that not acting is a catastrophe. And I do know that more or less nothing else has worked. Carbon emissions are still rising. The money is still with the fossil fuel industry. The fossil fuel industry has, in effect, declared war on ordinary people. They have so many billions of money for lobbying Parliament, for funding political parties. They inject vast amounts of money into the most sophisticated and cynical public relations and media distortion. I'm a doctor, a retired doctor, and the two things that I've learned from looking after some of the sickest patients in the hospital are, firstly, when you've got a problem, you have to admit you've got a problem, and you don't put it off till when you've come back from your holidays or when you've got a pay rise. And the second thing I've learned is that if you're given advice, even if it's hard advice, like your hair's going to drop out, you're going to be sick for months, you take that advice because it's better than dying, all right? We've got a government, and our aim is to influence the government, to change the rules, to take the power and the money away from the polluters.
Let's bring in Ruth on that point. Ruth, has he got a point? Is the planet completely in meltdown?
Well, this isn't just an opinion that the planet is in deep trouble. This is a huge scientific consensus. And governments across the world, 196 governments, which is almost all of them, have committed to phasing down fossil fuels under something called the Paris Agreement, which is a multilateral agreement about what we do about climate change collectively. Now, under that agreement, there's different articles, different elements of it, and one is Article 12, in which governments have signed up to educate and inform citizens about the risk they face, which, as Bing says, really is huge and should not be underestimated. And they've also signed up to empowering citizens to do something about it. Now, personally, I don't see that happening in a meaningful way, really, anywhere in the world. So I think Bing definitely has a point that people raising their voices and telling their government that they want to see more action, which many people are doing, but perhaps not enough to be really heard yet, is something that needs to happen. And it's something that the United Nations Secretary General for Climate Change has called for. He's, in a speech at Chatham House a few weeks ago, he asked for everyone to raise their voices to tell their governments that they want to see these changes.
Let's bring Sam in. Sam, the public really don't like just Stop Oil, the rights and wrongs of what they're doing. Just tell me where you sit on the debate and the state of things at the moment.
I think we really need to try and understand, does activism work? And I think you raised that question, really important one. Do people support climate activism? And I think the reality is at Social Change Lab, we're trying to measure these things. They're incredibly difficult things to measure. But we can use certain tools like public opinion polling and try and track the evolution of activism to try and understand its impact on policy. And there's now a building degree of evidence that's showing that activism, in fact, does work. Bing was raising the question saying he wasn't sure. Actually, there is now a body of evidence. So I'll take you back to 2019. Extinction Rebellion made a lot of noise, got a lot of attention on climate change, of course, Fridays for Future and the school strikes and others. And public opinion in the UK, to take an example, concern for the environment and climate change went up by 10% in just a matter of days. Right? It's pretty clear that the work of activists had a major impact there. But it wasn't just on public opinion. So we also saw policy shifts. We saw the UK Parliament declaring a climate emergency. We saw local councils, so local government, public bodies declaring climate emergency. And we saw a shift in discourse. I think this point is really important, is that the language we started to use around climate change as quite a passive term, suddenly it became climate emergency, climate breakdown, right? So this is just one example where a group adopting quite controversial tactics, maybe the Millwall of activists, right? But actually, it didn't matter because they had significant impact on policy, on public opinion, and on discourse.
Sam, what you just mentioned there, this is according to YouGov. Let's take a look at that statistic. Concern for climate jumped by 10% after a period of various different Extinction Rebellion mass protests. This was in 2019, and then COP26 in 2021. As a result, the environment ranked as one of the top 3 most important issues facing the country. This was thought by 40% of Britons, following only the economy and healthcare. Well, let's get the policing view on this. Peter, the Metropolitan Police, we see officers spending an awful lot of their time de-gluing people from buildings, from road surfaces. I mean, how do you even begin to police an organisation like Just Stop Oil?
It's very difficult, and the police are caught in the middle, as they are within so many other things, where you've got one group of people, in this case Just Stop Oil, and similar groups, determined to raise awareness of what I think most officers, let alone anybody else, would look at and go, yeah, there's a problem here. To raise awareness of that, and to try and gain more government attention on particular aspects of that, but using tactics which get in the way of everyday life. Now, any protest is going to create some sort of disruption to everyday life, no matter what it is. If you have the simplest, quietest, lowest level of trouble, smallest march of 100 people through a small town, let alone central London, then that is going to disrupt some people's journeys. It's going to get in the way of some people taking their kids to school, of some people going to a hospital appointment or whatever. Now, when you multiply that up to the scale of these protests and the nature of the tactics used, which take longer to resolve, and apply that to things like the M25 motorway or central London at rush hour or whatever it might be, then you multiply up the amount of trouble that's caused, the amount of difficulty that's caused, the amount of disruption that's caused to other people. Now, what the police need to do is tread a very, very difficult line in the middle of allowing those who wish to protest to have the freedom to do that, but also to minimise the detrimental impacts on everybody else who isn't involved in that protest. And so they're caught in the middle, and it is a really, really difficult thing to get right.
Bing, I just want to ask you about a couple of incidents I've seen where ambulances have been disrupted by your fellow protesters. People going to various different hospital appointments have been late because of Just Stop Oil. Do you justify that kind of behaviour?
Look, Just Stop Oil should not need to exist. We shouldn't be here. We shouldn't have to disrupt. But the fact is that the government should be looking after us, and it's not. The media should be telling the truth, which is that things are really bad, and they're not. And they should be linking what's really bad to the action that's required, which is to stop burning fossil fuels. And they're not doing it. And the people who are really at fault are the people who are making vast sums of money, and politicians that are supporting those people on the back of polluting vast numbers of people. I hate the idea of disrupting anybody. I spent my life working in a hospital, desperately waiting for a patient to get to the hospital. Some really sick people. I know what the problem is. By the way, we've had a Freedom of Information request, number of them, and none of them have shown up this trope, which has come from the right-wing press, that we've caused problems. Ambulance drivers are fantastically good at getting around all sorts of disruption. No, look, we've got a major problem here. We've got a story which is being told by the polluters, and we have got to change people's minds. And we have got to stop burning all fossil fuels very, very soon. And I know people don't like Just Stop Oil, but we're a bit like the suffragettes. And Emmeline Pankhurst, who now has a statue outside Parliament, said the most important argument in modern politics is the broken window pane. If you're going to change something in a really big way, if you're going to take money and power away from the status quo, you need to disrupt.
Tell me, have you been arrested?
I've been arrested many times.
And how does that make you feel? I mean, you're a doctor, you're a pillar of the community. How did it feel being arrested, taken away by police, court appearances, I'm presuming?
Yes, and I've paid a large amount of money. Every time you see a protest-type person being called an eco-zealot, please just listen to me now. That person will have spent time locked in a cell. It's frightening. They will have had to go to court. It's very disruptive. They will have paid almost certainly large fines, court costs, and many people have gone to prison. Just this week, Several people have gone to prison. Our government is not listening to the message, and like all bad governments, they choose to shoot the messenger.
Well, this is a new government. They've only been in power a week. The previous administration.
I suspect that this government will be marginally better, but not in any way adequate, both to the task nor to dealing with the message.
Ruth, are these people the new suffragettes?
Well, Just Stop Oil are actually quite a lot more moderate than the suffragettes were. If you look at what the suffragettes did, they blew up MPs' houses, they went on hunger strikes, hundreds of them were arrested. Their acts of civil disobedience could not be described as non-violent. And I think we forget about that when we look back on the suffrage movement. You know, that's seen as something that was heroic and that made a huge change in society that we're all grateful for. I know that I turned to my daughters on election day and told them the story of the suffragettes and why it was important that I went to exercise my right to vote. They were very much on the right side of history. And I think with Just Stop Oil, we also need to be aware of what is on the other side of the coin. So climate risks, climate hazards, we're starting to see that a bit more in our daily lives. We're starting to see droughts, we're starting to see flooding. But those aren't the real things that we should be worried about. What we really should worry about is the huge disruption that comes from climate impacts around the world, that disrupts things like our food system, that creates things like the environmental changes that lead to pandemics. Some people attribute the COVID-19 pandemic to some of that environmental disruption. Like, these are really big threats to our way of life, and they will have huge implications for people's health. So many people have already died in heat waves in the UK and in Europe, around the world. And I think we do need to be aware of that risk. As I say, governments aren't educating people about the risk that we face from climate change. And perhaps if they were, Just Stop Oil and other organisations like them would be seen somewhat differently.
Sam, is it too late? Have we gone too far already?
I think we have grounds for optimism exactly because of the upswell in civil society and activism that we're seeing. And like we said, in terms of the increase in concern for climate action, when you have that level of concern for an issue, politicians will respond, but not automatically. Right? Civil society needs to act. We were talking about history, we were talking about the suffragettes, and I think it's a really interesting bit of research I saw about Martin Luther King, some polling in the mid-1960s, at the height of the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King had already won the Nobel Peace Prize, and he had 63% unfavorability ratings among North Americans, right? Now he's remembered as a hero. I think 4% of Americans disapprove of him now. So it's important not to rewrite history and think of these people who were always treated as heroes. And we've also talked about like so-called backlash effects, like the impact of disruptive protest, turning people against climate change. And actually, there's some really contested debates about this. Some evidence has shown a small backlash effect when it comes to disruptive protest. We did some polling on Just Stop Oil before and after they'd run a number of protests and found no decrease in support for climate and environmental issues. Right? That's the key distinction. People might get angry with the groups, they might get angry with the activists. If you ask Bingett, he'd probably say he doesn't care about that. What they care about is, are people aware that climate change is an issue, and do they support climate policies? When people see a disruptive protest, they don't say, oh, we need to, that's it, we need to pump fossil fuels into the atmosphere, I'm sick of this, right? But it gets the attention, that's the goal of the work. And just one final point, one interesting outcome from Just Stop Oil protests that we found in our research was that people actually, after hearing about the protests, ended up being more likely to be willing to engage in activism themselves. They might not lock on, they might not want to get arrested in pursuit of support for climate policies, but they were more willing to write to their MP, they were more willing to volunteer for a local charity or to donate to a climate charity. So I think there is some interesting outcomes based on this disruptive protest that we need to dig into the details a bit more. And I think some of the media debates around this are very binary, aren't they? Either disruptive groups are bad for the movement or they're good for it. Either they're bad for the fight against climate change or they're good for it. In fact, actually, they have a lot of outcomes, they have a lot of impacts, some of which I think are unexpected.
Peter, London is a city of 8 million people. It's busy every day, every night. Getting people in, getting people out safely is important. Just talk to me about the policing challenges of what happens when someone glues themselves to a train carriage or the M25 roadway surface. I mean, it just takes up a huge amount of manpower.
It does, and it's really difficult to manage, especially when it's something that isn't pre-planned. When something's pre-planned, the police will put in place all manner of arrangements to mitigate the impact on others, to ensure that there are alternative routes for emergency vehicles and such like, and do days, weeks and months of planning to make sure that the net detrimental impacts are minimised whilst whatever the protest is that's being planned takes place. But when you've got something that's spontaneous, that is incredibly difficult to manage. And there is no way in a million years that the police are going to be in a position to react sufficiently speedily to prevent very significant disruption. If protesters, going back to the days of the M25 protests, suddenly descend on a particular junction on the M25 and block the carriageways in both directions, well, at rush hour, that leads to tailbacks of miles and miles and miles of traffic in virtually no time at all. And within that traffic, there are very limited options for dealing with anything that arises as an emergency vehicle caught in those backlogs, or whatever it might be, especially as we've now got these so-called smart motorways with no hard shoulder for emergency vehicles to use. And so spontaneous protest is particularly difficult to manage. The police can plan for, well, what if someone turns up at one of the junctions on the M25, or turns up at such and such roundabout on the North Circular, or turns up at the junction bank in the City of London and blocks it all up at 9 o'clock in the morning or whatever time it's planned for. And they can run tabletop scenarios and they can plan whatever they can to try and mitigate that. But when it happens, those resources that are needed aren't going to be immediately available. The police service for the last 15, 20 years has been struggling to try and have sufficient resources available to do day-to-day policing. It doesn't have a huge box of officers sitting around waiting for something so spontaneous to happen. And so officers are scrambled from other duties. They may or may not have got any particular training in dealing with this particular incident. And it takes some time, probably 3 or 4 hours, before sufficient resources are there with officers that have had training and are equipped to deal with those issues before they can get there and deal with it. And so the amount of disruption is magnified tenfold, 100-fold, compared to a planned operation.
Bing, talk to me about Stonehenge, 4,000-year-old monument, national treasure, and Just Stop Oil thought it was okay to go and deface it.
May I just respond to Peter and
Go
just
for
say
it.
thank you, Peter, for all your help. But the fact is that the disruption that you have to deal with is nothing compared to the disruption that the Caribbean people have had to deal with. A little island where 90% of the houses were destroyed by the worst ever hurricane that's ever happened in that particular situation. 100% of the population without any housing. That means all the pregnant ladies will have no antenatal care. They'll have to give birth in the dirt. I'm sorry, but this is a matter of proportionality, and the crisis is terrible. Stonehenge, right?
Yes.
Stonehenge, just before, around the time of Stonehenge, there was a big march with 100,000 people, including the National Trust, the RSPB, every 300 organisations from the most radical flank, like Just Stop Oil, right through to really ordinary people, representing something like 8 million people of this country. Almost no coverage, hardly covered by the BBC at all, zilch coverage. Stonehenge.
Global headlines.
Can you guess how many Twitter hits that saw? Over 100 million Twitter views in the first 3 days.
So it's all about clicks.
So it's not all about clicks. It's about disruption causing dialogue. Look, we're here.
We're talking about it now.
We're talking about the climate. And bless you, Thank you very much. This is an intelligent conversation with some really informed people and somebody from the state very clearly saying that there's a cost to this. We're having an intelligent conversation. It's fantastic. But the problem is that the way the system works, particularly the way the media works, this conversation is very rare. It's absolutely necessary, and we need to have very, very much more of it. And I'm sorry to throw some custard powder on Stonehenge, but if I can get 100 million people even thinking a little bit about the climate, I can sleep marginally less badly in the evening.
Ruth, Bing, Sam and Peter, thank you all so much for your insight on that. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Search for Roundtable TRT World, and if you like what you see there, please do hit that subscribe button. But for now, from me and Brady and all of the team here on Roundtable, goodbye and thank you for watching.